But I think before we even get to the consequences thing, we have to remember that if the whole point and purpose is to teach and build skills so they become self-disciplined, then they have to be in a state in their nervous system in which they can learn. So that's why in our no drama discipline approach, we really talk about the idea that the brain is either in a reactive state where it can't learn. This is what tantrums look like. This is what disrespectful, back talk looks like. So either the brain's in a reactive state or it's in a receptive state in which it's ready to learn. So the first step is my child ready to learn, and am I ready to teach? If the answer is no to either of those questions, it's not the right time. And so in the name of discipline, and by that I mean teaching and skill building, the first thing we have to do is get our kid receptive. And the way we do that is through connection, relationship, regulation, time, space, nurture, whatever it takes.
It's a brand new day. Wake up every morning and say, it's a brand new day. Take a good day, make it great, okay?
Hello and welcome to the Whole Parent Podcast. My name is John. I am the host of the Whole Parent Podcast, and I am at Whole Parent on all of the social medias. If you are just joining this podcast for the first time, maybe this is the first episode that you've ever found. This is a podcast all about parenting, but it's not a podcast that's going to make you feel worse about your parenting journey. It's a podcast that's going to give you excellent evidence-based tips that are going to help you parent with confidence and raise resilient kids. And so if you're looking to upgrade your parenting, not because you feel ashamed of the way that you've been parenting, not because you're, I'm stoking your fear or anything like that, but just because you want to have a community of people that you're learning alongside, myself included, this is the podcast for you. So if you're not already subscribed, if you haven't already gone in and rated the show and written a review, if you're a regular listener and you've listened to a bunch of episodes, please, you help this message get out to so many more parents. This episode today is probably my favorite episode that I have ever recorded. And that is because I get to talk to my personal parenting hero about my favorite topic in parenting. It has been a dream getting to do this episode, and I have recorded it, and now I'm coming back and recording the intro, and it's just been spinning around in my head for days, the stuff that we talked about. I feel like I'm bearing the lead here. This episode is about punishment-free parenting. That's the title of this episode. You're going to hear me talk so much more about this topic in general, but this episode is my first episode about punishment-free parenting, and I get to have my first episode with punishment-free parenting with Dr. Tina Payne Bryson, the author who co-authored, along with Dan Siegel, so many of my favorite parenting books, including probably my all-time favorite parenting book, The Whole Brain Child. They've co-authored books together, including The Whole Brain Child, No Drama Discipline, and so many more. And so we talk a little bit about that in this episode, but we also just talk about why punishment is an ineffective way to help your kids grow into resilient, healthy adults. And so if you are a parent who has come from a punishment paradigm, you maybe were punished growing up like so many parents or so many kids and who are now parents. If you are wondering whether that punishment was what you needed or whether it was helpful or whether there's another way to parent, that's this episode. We talk all about it. And so whether you're tuning in for the first time or whether you have been around and you've listened to this podcast before, welcome to one of the best episodes in this very young podcast, Punishment-Free Parenting with Tina Payne Bryson. Welcome, everybody, to the Whole Parent Podcast. I am super, super excited today that we have Dr. Tina Payne Bryson, PhD. Although you don't say doctor and PhD at the same time. Tina, you are the author of two of my very favorite parenting books, The Whole Brain Child and No Drama Discipline. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. I'm such a big fan of your work and what you're doing and the impact you're having. So I can't wait to have a conversation with you.
That's like the craziest thing that I've ever heard, that you're a fan of my work. So I'm going to try and not like fanboy out too much. But yeah, we're talking about a bunch of stuff today, but especially we're talking about punishment-free parenting, which is a term that I have not said this to anybody else, and maybe I'm going to get in trouble with my publisher, because the official title of my book, which I have just now finally turned in the final copy of the manuscript, although it's not quite through copy editing yet. The title that I have been working under is punishment-free parenting. So this is like what my passion is all about. And you're one of my favorite people on the internet and in books to talk about this with. And so I'm going to ask you to do something that I want our conversation to be kind of unique and not just exactly what you've been on so many podcasts and talked about this stuff. But I do want to define two terms here, because I feel like we have to begin from this place if we're going to talk about punishment-free parenting. And the two terms are discipline and punishment. How are those terms different? How can we use those terms differently? And just go with that.
I'd love to hear we can co-create a definition, because you and I are very, very conciliant in our lens. Well, first of all, when Dan and I were writing No Drama Discipline, a colleague of ours who we really respected, another parenting author, said, knew we were writing a book about discipline, and she said, please don't use the word discipline in the title of your book. And we said, well, why? And she said, because when you say discipline, people immediately think punishment. They immediately, that's connoted in that word. And so Dan and I were like, but the meaning of the word, if you go back to the original meaning of the word, it means to teach. And really, when we talk about it from a brain perspective, when we're talking about repeated experiences in a brain that's plastic and moldable from repeated experiences, we also add the idea of that discipline is to teach and to build skills. And so Dan and I were like, let's do something really bold, and let's not only use the word discipline intentionally in the title of our book, but let's reclaim the original meaning of that word, which is to teach and to build skills. Now, punishment is really to make the child, or I guess obviously you can punish your spouse too. So punishment is really about making the other person have a really unpleasant experience just in response to what they did. It's not at all based on teaching. It's not at all about based on building skills. It's actually to create a sense of dread, pain, discomfort, emotional distress, in order to kind of build in the idea that if I make them feel terrible, then they won't repeat the behavior. But that's actually not how discipline works. So you can clearly tell I'm not a big fan of punishment myself either. And that's not to say that, and notice I never used the word consequences as part of the conversation of punitiveness or punishment. But punishment, how would you define punishment?
Yeah, so, I really appreciate everything you just said, and getting back to the original sense of the word for discipline, my background being not in psychology or developmental psychology, but in part ancient languages and specific ancient Koine Greek, from which we get the word discipline. I really appreciate that, because you don't have that sense in Koine Greek that there are punitive actions being taken. It's more of the follower, right? So like you have the person who's the teacher, and then you have the disciple, or from which we get the word discipline. So I really appreciate the way in which you reframe that, and I would agree with that. I also agree with your friend who said, these words are synonymous, right? Discipline means punishment, and I have to go through that, because I think, like you said, unless you are bold enough to call your book No Drama Discipline, which I have sitting next to me, because I'm going to read a quote.
And by the way,
unless you're bold enough,
discipline was actually one of our considered titles. So that just shows you how much line.
No. Punishment-free discipline. Wow. So but this is the thing, right? So okay. So how I would define punishment? Like, let me not go super ADHD here and go way off the rails. I did take the meds, so I'm like, we'll stay on track. But I think for me, punishment is anything that's retributive. Right? So if you're looking for retribution, then it's going to be punitive. And so whether it's the over emphasis of consequences, which again, I have an entire chapter in my book that's, about consequences. So it's not like consequences-free parenting, I think, would be basically the critique of the modern gentle parenting movement. I think some of which is justified,
100%,
which is because 100%. We don't really have we don't have a term for, we don't know what gentle parenting is, right? It's not a scientific term. And so because it's not a scientific term,
And I think of it
It's a made-up
honestly very much synonymous with permissive parenting. I get put in the gentle parenting category all the time, and that some of my books were kind of some of the foundational pieces of gentle parenting. I don't accept, like, that's not how I identify at all. Because
oh man, you're gonna get so canceled. You're gonna get so.
I know. I'm a fan.
Well, so I made this video. Last week, Tina. Like, I made this video. It's the last video on my account from and I said I'm not a gentle parent because the way in which we define gentle parenting is it's just too permissive, and I don't do that, and I'm not about that. And people were like, well, then you don't know what gentle parenting is. So I'm just
no one knows what gentle parenting is because it's a made up thing that's basically kind of lumping a bunch of stuff together. So I think what we know for, and we can get into this, what we've known for 80 plus years is that kids do best when they have high emotional responsiveness, connectedness, nurturing. I wrote my dissertation on what I'm about to say here many years ago, that kids do well when they get that gentle, respectful, connected parent. Plus, and this is the part that gentle parenting often leaves out, plus really sturdy, stable boundaries, limits, and a grown-up who's really making them feel like the grown-up knows what's happening and is going to protect them and keep them safe.
Well, and even within those boundaries, flexibility to go up to those boundaries, right? Which I think that's the other side of my critique of gentle parenting, which is it leads to a gentle childhood, which is exactly the opposite of what you want for your kid for resilience, right? Like, you don't want a kid who is so, and I get where it comes from. Like, none of us want our kids to hurt. Like, none of us want our kid to fall off the slide. The difference is those of us who understand that kids falling off the slide is a natural part of their development and is ultimately a good thing, because when they fall off the slide, then they're less likely to jump out the second story window. That's actually a good process. And the kids who have no consequences, whether those are the consequences of their own actions, I climbed too high and I couldn't get down, like, those consequences actually teach. Versus punishment is saying, hey, and this is an interesting kind of point that I try and make in the book. I'm so many parents are so worried about the actual consequences their children will face that they impose a punishment because they're unwilling to see the consequence through. And so many parents are like, I'm afraid that my child will be socially alienated by not sharing. And so I'm going to punish strictly because that's my own shame and baggage from middle school. And so now I'm acting that out on my 7-year-old, and I'm basically assuming that this is, the worst possible scenario. I think you guys were the ones who talked about shark music, right? So like they do the shark music
we did
thing.
talk about it, but it came from the circle of security attachment intervention.
Right.
I always want to give credit
right. The circle of security,
to people's original work.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, but I think, yeah, it's, you guys kind of brought in the parenting, the pop parenting area, right? And so I appreciate that you say that you don't identify with the term gentle parenting, because I say that and I get like so much pushback. Part of it is that my primary work until the book is in social media. So because of that, and it's on social media, and so because of that, I think a lot of people are like, hey, you're one of us. Come help us redefine this gentle parenting thing. My thing is, I like parenting too much to wed it to a word that's currently not helping, right? It's creating more harm. I don't want to say harm, but it's creating more confusion than it's solving. And so it's a little bit different.
Mona Delahook and Eliza Pressman and I, in different conversations, have had conversations about this very thing. And we're like, what could we call it? We never really came up with anything that great. But I think it was Mona that was like, what if we called it responsive parenting or something like that?
That's good. So this is why I picked whole parenting. So I just said, look, we could do respectful, we could do connect. These were that when we started the account and we were looking for like the available handles, it was like connection, responsive, respectful. Some of those were taken, but those were our three. And then I landed on whole. And the reason I landed on whole was because I said, look, ultimately, this is a holistic approach that also gets to dealing with the parent. And so the thing with responsive parenting is that it still feels to me somewhat child focused, and that it's all about how the parent is responding. And so many parents think like, I have to fake my way into that response, because all that matters is that I like do the right thing. And it's like, no. If you don't internalize these principles, like you can't fake your way through this. You're going to fall short. And so that's why I picked whole, is because it's kind of a catch-all word. I mean, you guys did too for the whole brain child, right? Like it's a catch-all word, and it's talks, and I got it kind of not so much from the whole brain child, but from Brene Brown's work of like being wholehearted. And so that's why I was like, oh man, like that principle really, I resonate with that. So that's my contribution. I call it whole parenting because I feel like that, or in the book I call it punishment-free parenting, which is, I don't like because it defines it by what it's not. But
I think it's so important what you're saying there, because, you know, throughout all of the, you know, 4 books that Dan and I have written together, and I actually have a book coming out January of 2024, co-authored with a play therapist called The Way of Play. In all of the books I've written, we always talk about, it's not so much what we do, but who we are with our children. And that's one of the big problems I have with attachment parenting. I think there are some beautiful things that attachment parenting supports, but, you know, in my book, The Power of Showing Up, that I wrote with Dan, you know, one of the things we say is, like, I often define, when I start talking about attachment and attachment science, I say, well, let me start with what it's not. It's not attachment parenting. Attachment parenting is often a checklist of behaviors, and attachment's never about a checklist of behaviors. And what we do is not as much as important as who we are. And so that's why I really love that you chose whole as your thing. And as you know, in all of my books, at the end of each chapter, Dan and I have a section that's about integrating ourselves or showing up for ourselves, or, you know, those kinds of things, because it does start with us. And really we know that and this is back to the idea of discipline, the research is very clear that children learn best through, number one, what they do themselves. So what they practice, what they do, you know, what they, you know, put their hands on and actually do themselves. And number two, what is modeled for them. And so those two things are part of, you know, who we are and what we do and how whole we are. And also understanding our brokenness. I'm going to use that word in response to whole, our flaws, our, whatever, and that we should always be reflecting on and repairing. Those are all part of what we bring and into how our children's brains get wired.
Man, honestly, this is probably the most affirming conversation about my book. Like, you know, the process, there's definitely these moments where you're like, oh man, did I just write a terrible? Maybe you don't have these moments. Like I do. Like you, okay. That makes me feel really good because I just imagine like, oh man, how many bestsellers do you have to write until you're like, oh no, it's probably
no. I'll tell
good.
you. So I just turned my manuscript in like 2 months. So I'm like 2 or 3 months, you know, ahead of you in terms of manuscript turning in on this latest book. And I go through this process every time. And my editor at Penguin Random House is like, okay, Tina, you're doing that thing where I finish the book, I send it in, and I'm like, this book sucks. I hate this book. No one's going to ever read this book. I'm not contributing to the conversation at all. Like, I have all this, and I'm not a negative person like that. I don't beat myself up. I'm not critical of myself typically ever. But then when they send the copy edits back and I read it again, I'm like, oh, it's so good. Then I get, and then when I do the audio recording, I fall in love with the book. And so, you're good.
Okay. So I'm January 25 as well. So January 25 as well. So this is my, like, it just went through and it's through the sub edit. It's through the line edit. Now it's going to copy. So like I've just had that experience of reading it and going, okay, it's actually not that bad. But this conversation really, like, this is a lot of what I'm trying to talk about in the book. And it's a lot of like hey, it's modeling. It's also learning from mistakes and how we view mistakes and how we can readjust the way that we view mistakes. So kind of let's take a step back and ask the question. So why doesn't punishment work? Because I think that this is where a lot of parents, they see punishment seeming to work and they go, okay, well then this is all that works. And I think that what I've tried to do, what you've tried to do is say, actually, it doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? What's
and
the
for
hope?
what I'll say too, we have decades and decades of research that show that punishment is actually doesn't lead to that great of outcomes. So we kind of know this, but let's get into this question. I think you asked a really important question, and I really want to come back to something you said a few minutes ago after I answered this question about fears, because one of the big things I feel like has not been talked about, and I think it's fundamental. I've talked about it quite a bit, but it doesn't really get a lot of airtime on podcasts. People don't actually want to talk about it much. Is that fear-based parenting is what often leads us to punishment and leads us to the kinds of parenting moments that are totally unproductive. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'd love to come back to it. The reason that punishment doesn't work is because let's talk about what does work first. And that is that the way that children, so let's take one more step back, if you don't mind. To me, why even punish, or why discipline, or why why discipline at all? Why? For me, and when I talk to thousands and thousands of parents over the years, typically what I arrive to is, and I have 3 children who are now older. I have my kids are 17 and up. So I'm kind of on the other side of all of the years of doing discipline, right? And how it comes out.
And you have 3 boys. I do
have 3
too,
boys.
Right? I have 3 boys.
They're so awesome.
I have 3 boys.
They're the best. I mean, and if I had 3 girls, I would say the same thing. They're just, kids are amazing.
Of course.
And hard.
Of course.
And all of mine are very different, which is, again, why you'll very rarely see me be super prescriptive. Like, I typically don't come in with, except things that are based on the brain and the nervous system and relationship stuff that I know is typically, but we have to really know our kid and know that moment and really tune into what's happening in the moment in ourselves and in our kids. But why discipline at all? Well, the point and purpose to me of discipline is that children become self-disciplined, so that without us looking, without us saying anything, without us doing anything, they are making good decisions for themselves and for the world, out in the world as they develop. Now, the way that we get them there is, number one, something that is not at all within our control, and that is development. As the brain develops, as development unfolds, they reach levels of maturity that allow them to control impulses, to pause before action, to consider other people's feelings, to consider what might happen if I do this, what might happen if I don't do this. And these are all prefrontal cortex capacities that aren't fully developed until the late 20s. So part of what we're talking about here in terms of discipline, and I often tell parents this, even if you don't do anything, just development unfolding will help your kid become a more disciplined, good human being. So that's number one. And then number 2, what does work besides waiting for development is giving our children repeated experiences that help them get the reps. Just like when I lift weights and I do reps, that muscle gets stronger. When they have repeated experiences, this is how the brain fires and wires. So the repeated experiences they have is what wires their brains. So when we talk about discipline, I would I could throw a punishment out there and my kid might feel bad, or they might, I might be forcing them to make a retribution that's totally meaningless, or, maybe I spank, or maybe I threaten something, or maybe I take something away, or whatever I do in the name of punishment will often make them feel like bad. But often what they actually feel is that I'm unfair and I'm mean. So it actually pulls attention away from the feelings that we want them to have and the skills that they want to build. And I can certainly give a specific example around that from my own parenting. But I think that, oftentimes if we're like, go to your room, you can't have your play date today because you clearly can't be with people. So I'm just throwing out a punishment. It's the first thing I think of. So I throw it out there. My kid goes in his room and he starts thinking about how mean I am to do this to him. And it was actually his brother's fault. And I didn't even get the whole story. And I actually love his brother more than him. So all of his cognitive, attentional, emotional resources are to thinking about how it's everybody else's fault. And he's taking zero accountability. Right. So it's actually counterproductive. And I would say that 80% of what we do in the name of discipline is counterproductive because we're not holding in mind that really what we're trying to do is give them an experience to practice building a skill, or to learn that skill, or to learn, have the capacity to think about others or whatever. It might not be a specific skill, but an actual experience that is firing and wiring. And I think I'll say one more thing and then I'll pause because I could talk for 6 hours straight on this, is one of the
I'm sure we'd all be the wiser for it.
One of the big questions I really try to ask myself, and by the way, parents, I want to give you permission to not respond to the behavior in that moment. We've all been told you have to respond in the moment or it won't be effective. That's true of dogs, but it's not even true of 2-year-olds. I want to give you permission to say, I want to think about how I want to respond to this, or to say, you know what, let's all go take a break. Let's come back in 5 minutes. We're going to talk about this. Or after your 2-year-old has had a nap and a snack, you can go back and tell the story. Let's tell the story of how you threw your shoe at mommy's face earlier, whatever it is. Like, come back to it later. But what I want to be thinking about before I discipline is the way I'm responding and is the way I'm handling this moment going to move my child closer to doing it better the next time? And if the answer is no, it's not effective discipline.
Right. And I think that's such a key point. And that's kind of gets to the quote that I was going to read from you guys. But and I don't know, it's interesting when I read your books that you've co-authored with others, there are now moments where I can see the Tina thread shining through. But there are often moments where I'm like, oh man, I don't know which one of you said this. And so I think that's so cool that you guys can author books that way. I would really struggle to do that because I would be like, oh, I got to say it my way. That's also why the editing process has been difficult. But yeah, so I think that, what you said is, so many good nuggets in there, but ultimately we're working against their long-term development when we're using punitive actions. And I think that for me, and I have kids on the younger end, my oldest is 7, not 17. You said that your youngest is 17, right? So my oldest is 7. So when I look at, and my 3 kids are incredibly different too. And I actually think probably if parents paid really, really close attention to parenting, which is really, really hard in an age where most parents have 1 or 2 jobs. Most parents are to some extent addicted to their phone. Most parents and this is not like to shame any parent, like that's just life. I think it's really hard to be super attentive, but I think if we would realize that all of our kids are so different from one another. So I appreciate that you said that. But in my case, what works for one of my kids, I probably could have utilized punishment in a way that felt effective for my 3-year-old, but because I had my 7-year-old first and it was never going to work for him, I was so, I guess the word is blessed that it just never. And then I also came out of foster care training. So in foster care training, they tell you this is not going to work, which is why I think it's so interesting that so many of us just have not deconstructed the idea that punishment is the way that we correct behavior, because all of the experts and not like the, random guy who says, which I know how ironic it is that I'm saying this, but not the random guy who says that they're an expert on the internet, but the actual people who, like you, have done the work, who have written the dissertations, and then the people who are in the trenches in large scale academics and large scale institutional spaces like foster care, they know, and they've known. And I think that it's the average parent, we're the last ones to catch up often. So yeah, all this to say, it's really challenging for all of us. It's very challenging for every parent. And, I think that the decision to go punishment free is a good one that most parents should take. And in fact, I think all parents should take, which is a pretty audacious claim. In research, you're never supposed to say all, but I think all parents should take this approach, if for no other perspective than to change the mindset around it. To be more teaching focused.
So John, let's talk about consequences then, because when you say no punishment, I'm thinking your listeners are saying, well, does that mean I never what do I do? I used to do, I don't do it very much anymore. Occasionally I still do, but a lot of my clinical practice, besides doing therapy with kids and teens, was doing parenting consults. So parents would come in for 75 to 90 minutes. They'd come in with their questions and we'd wrestle with stuff. And what most parents, when they would walk in my office, would say, we know what we don't want to do, but we don't know what to.
We don't know what to do instead.
I would love to hear, how do you think about consequences? What do you tell parents about consequences? Or what do they do in the moment? So it's the longest chapter in the book. I realized that on my last read through, was that it's so nuanced. No, it's so nuanced. And so it's the longest chapter in the book. And the reason that it's the longest chapter in the book is because, number one, we have to deconstruct the idea that all
all punishment is consequence. Like, I guess all punishment is consequences, but not all consequences is punishment. Right?
That's beautifully said.
And so I think that the thing with consequences are, number one, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. At this point, I don't know if I can change it in the book, but we'll find out.
Copy editing.
Is that I say that, copy editing. I still have a shot. I say that logical consequences are a great option if natural consequences are either too extreme and become punitive, or have zero effect. And so my hierarchy for consequences is the idea that parents should do something in the moment. Almost never should you do anything other than maybe shut your mouth and walk away, unless imminent harm is going to come to someone, in which case you hold the boundary, you take away the, chainsaw that your kid is playing with. And then, and then you come back to the
Not
situation,
a good time for
right?
natural consequence there.
Right. Well, right. And actually, that's what's so interesting to me. And this is like where I get into the gentle parenting. Like, man, this is why there's so much nuance. I know parents who are like, yeah, I went punishment free, but these parents are still have not done any work around how brutal their own childhoods were. And so they go, I went punishment free. Now I just use natural consequences. And I'm like, oh, can you give me an example? And they're like, well, my daughter forgot to bring water on our walk. And I'm like, okay, so how was the natural consequence? Like, she got thirsty and you had to walk back to the car. It's like, no, we weren't going to go back. She was just super dehydrated by the time we got back to the car after 10 miles. And I actually had to carry her back the last mile because she had passed out. And I'm like, not a natural consequence. I mean, I guess a natural consequence,
punitive.
but highly punitive at that point.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say at the best, we allow our children to face the consequences of their own actions when those are proportional. And then I have a whole acronym for how we do logical consequences. Then the next step is to ask, are consequences warranted? Am I being reasonable in this moment? Most of the time that we're disciplining, historically, we're not being reasonable. Like, parents get triggered and then we do kind of our worst parenting. Is the consequence associated, right, to the actual action that's been taken by the child? Is the consequence even related, in other words, to what they're doing? Or am I just saying, give me your iPad for a week? Like that, then that just is going to lead to mom's a jerk, dad's a jerk. And then is it proportional? And so I think if we can handle those things once the natural consequences potentially fail, like, for example, your kid doesn't clean up their mess and the natural consequence is it's messy. Well, the kid might not care.
Right.
Like, I just don't care that it's messy. Not a good natural consequence if there's no impact. So then we ask, okay, well, is a consequence warranted? Maybe cleaning up the room can be a consequence. Am I being reasonable? Well, if I'm feeling pretty solid and in my prefrontal cortex and not reactive, yeah. Is it associated? Yeah, clean up the room. Is it proportional? Yeah, don't clean the whole house. Yeah. Right? I think that if we can move through those steps, then we can get to a place where we're not doing things in order to make our child feel bad, be afraid, or experience either physical, mental, emotional, or relational pain, which I think basically all punishment does. I think, then we can move
one
forward.
of the ways I like to think about all of this is the idea that, obviously our child's safety is first. And I mean actual safety, like physical safety. I don't mean that they don't like it. I mean, like, they're going to burn their hand on the stove, whatever. They're going to run into the street. So their physical safety is the very front burner. The next front burner is the relationship. And any particular behavior is back burner. Or to say it a different way, front burner is relationship, back burner is behavior, unless it's a life-threatening one. Then that's a first one. But I think before we even get to the consequences thing, we have to remember that if the whole point and purpose is to teach and build skills so they become self-disciplined, then they have to be in a state in their nervous system in which they can learn. So that's why in our no drama discipline approach, we really talk about the idea that the brain is either in a reactive state where it can't learn. This is what tantrums look like. This is what disrespectful, back talk looks like, slamming door, like all of the stuff that our kids do often when they're reactive in the moment, or that we do when we're reactive in the moment. So either the brain's in a reactive state or it's in a receptive state in which it's ready to learn. So the first step is my child ready to learn, and am I ready to teach? If the answer is no to either of those questions, it's not the right time. And so in the name of discipline, and by that I mean teaching and skill building, the first thing we have to do is get our kid receptive. And the way we do that is through connection, relationship, regulation, time, space, nurture, whatever it takes. And the biggest pushback I get on that is, well, so you're going to hug them and you're going to be like, I can see you're having such a hard time right now, Betty. I'm right here with you. And you're reinforcing bad behavior. And I say, no, I'm not reinforcing bad behavior. I'm giving their brain a rep of going from a dysregulated state back into a regulated state so that they can do that for themselves, which is number one for self-discipline. And then once they're receptive, then I'm going to ask the discipline questions, which we have in No Drama Discipline, is what is it, let's chase the why. Like, what's the why behind this behavior? What was really happening there? Yep. And then the second thing is, what is it I want my child to learn or do differently? And then the third question is, how do I effectively support giving them an experience to help them do that? So it's that framework before I ever think about consequences. I'm a big fan of natural consequences. Even experts who go on national television shows get this wrong. So let's be really clear. Natural consequences are the things that happen without you doing anything. So your child leaves their bat on the baseball field. You go back an hour later when your kid remembers that the bat's gone. That's a natural consequence. You didn't call someone and say, hey, go steal my kid's bat to teach them a lesson, whatever.
Logical consequence.
When a natural consequence happens, we actually often pile on the lecture at that point. And that actually becomes punitive because we're making them feel worse. Instead, what's more effective is to be like, oh, you loved that bat. That's so disappointing. Like, we can actually authentically feel with our child with empathy about that. And then we can do some problem solving. Say, what do you think we could do? Like, I know you need a new bat. What should we do? How do you think we should handle this? And you kind of problem solve with your child, giving them reps using their prefrontal cortex to be part of the problem solving. If it's not, and then a logical consequence is something that makes sense, connected to the thing that it is, to help them learn to do better the next time. So it's funny, like lots of times people like, when we talk about like, oh, I don't use consequences, I only have reflective dialogues. I'll tell you, I won't give the specifics to protect my child's privacy. But about 3 weeks ago, one of my kids was dishonest about something and had violated a limit that we had agreed upon. And so we sat down and I said, I know that's not okay. So what happened? Tell me about this. And we had a conversation. And then I said, hey, I want to talk to Dad about this. And then let's all talk together about how we want to handle this going forward, because this isn't okay. And I don't want to see this again. So we need to come up with a different plan together. And so why don't you think about that too? So then we came back together the next day and we had like a 30-minute conversation. It was really sweet. My son said, I know I've broken trust. And I said, you have not broken trust. You have made so many trust deposits. You made a withdrawal from the thing, and you can easily make more deposits, and so it's restoration.
We can refill that.
But at the end of the conversation, he smirked and I said, what? And he said, I'm just not going to do that again. So I don't have to have this kind of a conversation again. So even the reflective dialogue feel like our kids don't want to do that. They don't want to sit and wrestle and they feel our disappointment. That is a consequence. So I think anybody who says I don't do any consequences, well, even the look on your face or the conversation you have with your child can be seen as a consequence. It's really, I think we just need to be less rigid around, saying it's this or it's not this or whatever. We have to be really nuanced. And so the whole point and purpose, though, of if, how, and why, and when we use consequences should be intentional and thoughtful, and it should be in service of giving them an experience that helps them move toward being able to do it better the next time. Not
and I think right. So I'm going to read the quote because you just said it and you said it so beautifully in No Drama Discipline that I have to read it.
Please, I haven't probably heard it in a while.
Right. So it comes from the 20 discipline mistakes even great parents make. And this is the quote I've made. And
on my Instagram account, I actually
Maybe this week.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe today. On my Instagram account, I actually went through, I did Mistake Mondays, and there was a period of time where I kind of went through one every Monday, and I was like, I could do this series forever because we make lots of mistakes.
And man, I feel like this is a moment. I mean, let me read this because I feel like this is a moment. Okay, so it says it's from mistake number one. It says, and this is the text behind it, says the goal of discipline is not to make sure that each infraction is immediately met with a consequence. The real goal of discipline is to teach our children how to live well in the world. And I think that statement alone, I think I remember reading that the first time and going, oh, and that might've been, it's hard to say like there's like a moment of like, oh, eureka, this is the work I need to do. But that was the moment where I went, I agree so much with this, but how did I not know this? Like what, I don't even, like what year did No Drama Discipline come out? Like 2015 or something.
So it's
like
almost 10 years old.
Okay. So almost 10 years old. I probably read that quote in 2020. So 5 years after it had come out, I read it and I went, how was this not, and maybe it was national dialogue, but how was this not never presented to me? And not to mention Whole Brain Child's what, 2012. So like that's another 3 years before that. So like, how is this just not part of the dialogue? And I think that is really, really important. And I think part of the reason why it's not part of the dialogue, and this is kind of the point that you just made, I think the reason why my account blew up in the way that it did was not that I was saying anything new. I think three things. One, I think the way in which I communicate is pretty approachable,
sure.
Which I think is good, right? That's just a good thing to be. And I think the more that we can continue to be approachable with conversations like the one that we're having, I think the more this dialogue can be furthered. Second thing is that I was a guy saying it, which I think, and I wasn't a guy with an MD or a PhD behind my name saying it. So I was just a dad saying it. I think that's important. But I think number three is that I own all of the mistakes. So that's the thing that, we were chatting before we even started, and I'm not going to name names, but one of the struggles that I think that we see on social media, especially, but even in parenting books that are published, even in podcasts, is that all of the people who are a little bit insecure in their expertise, and they're like, I'm talking about parenting, but I'm not always perfect. Like, you didn't want to see me in Target yesterday. Like, they don't say that though. They'll just continue to kind of further this. Like, look at all these amazing fun activities that I did over the Easter weekend with my kids. And it's like, yeah, but what about the moment at the end of Easter where like your kid didn't want to go to bed because you've been completely out of routine and you were at somebody's house and you didn't get home in time for bath time. And so all of the neural pathways associated with melatonin release didn't fire. So then your kid's jumping off the walls and, oh, by the way, they just had 14 chocolate eggs on the way home and they probably needed to wash them up, but you didn't really. And so like, they're like feeling sticky. And then like right before they fall asleep, they're like, I'm sticky. And you're just like, go to sleep. Like, you didn't talk about that though. And so because you didn't, you feel like, and this is where we can kind of return as a punishment for free parenting, but like, because none of us are owning that, and I think you do a good job of that. I try and do a good job of that. I think Eliza does a good job of that. I know that my friend Eli, she's attachment-based parenting, does a good job of this. Like, all of us are trying to forward this idea because when you don't talk about that, then it feels unattainable. And so that's, I think the question is, we've talked about consequences, okay, how this is a better alternative to punishment. But really, what do we do? Like, when we're not going to be a perfect parent all the time, how do we deal with that? Because I think that's the thing where people go, I can't become a punishment for parenting because I have to have this in my back pocket because I'm afraid that I'm going to have no tools. And what do I do if I fall short?
Yeah, I think again, you came back to that, the F word, fear, fear-based parenting.
Yes.
And I will say that when I reflect after I've been the parent I hope not to be, which happens all the time, and I will say has happened less and less and less over time as I've practiced this approach to parenting, and it's become more wired in my brain to be more automatic. And
Tina, would you say that you've built some neural pathways around the way that you would like to parent?
Because I get to talk about it all the time, I'm always setting my intention, right? So it's like, I get all those reps all the time in terms of my lens. But also I will say it's a lot easier not to yell as kids get older because it's easier in many, many ways. They're not having meltdown. They say I'm going to bed at 8:30 and you don't see them, but they're up, talking to their friends or whatever. So I think you don't have the trenches kind of thing. It's not to say that teenagers are easier, although I will say, I felt like age 4 was the hardest for all 3 of my kids. And I have 24, 21, and 17-year-old kids now. So those of you with 4-year-olds, hang in there. Fear-based parenting. So when I reflect, almost always my moments when I'm not the parent I want to be, and I go against what I believe in terms of this lens that we've been talking about, are always rooted in fear for me. And I think what happens is, and there's a lot of fear-based parenting that gets stoked on social media too, like stuff like, you let your kids sleep in bed with you, they'll never sleep on their own. Or maybe your pediatrician tells you that. That's not true. There's no if this, then this forever for every kid. That's just not the way it works. And I think, like I love to tell a story about a time my kid, he was probably 7 or 8 at the time, and I had offered to pick him up after school and take him to the Sticky Theater. It's not actually called that, but it's a discount theater. So it was gross inside. So it's called the Sticky Theater.
I love that.
So I was like, hey, I'm going to pick you up after school. And he was like, really? That's so fun. Like, he was super excited, grateful, just the response I wanted from him. And then he says, can I get popcorn? And I said, no, we're not getting popcorn today. We've already had too much junk food. I'll bring a snack and when I pick you up. And he pouted, arms folded, pouting. And so what happens immediately for me is it moves me from, now that's not what I expected. It's not what I hoped for. But it immediately moves me to a fear-based place that my kid is entitled, he's spoiled, he's a brat, he doesn't understand how much privilege he has, all of these things. And so that leads me to want to be like, I'm not taking you to the movies, which is totally punitive. It makes me, my first response, even knowing everything that I know and practicing, is to say, guess what? I am in charge here. I'm in control of you, and I'm going to take this away from you. That's my first instinct, is to say, fine, we're not going to the theaters. If you're going to pout, you don't get to go. But what I did instead in that moment, it's much more helpful, because I have tons and tons of terrible parenting moments. After playing Yahtzee with my boys, I threw the dice across the room, yelled at them because they were fighting, and I lost my mind. So I have lots and lots of parenting fails. But in this moment, I first regulated myself, and then I said to him, something just happened when I said, go to the movies. You got so excited when I said no popcorn. Something happened. What happened? So I start with curiosity. And he says, I'm disappointed. I love movie popcorn. I don't get it very often. And I really wanted it. And so I say, yeah, sometimes when we want something and we don't get it, that can feel really disappointing. So what I did, and I said, now we're not getting popcorn, but we can still go to the movies. Would you still like to go? So I'm still holding my boundary of no popcorns. I'm not saying, fine, you can have popcorn. So that's where I'm emotionally responsive, connected, gentle. And I'm using air quotes when I say that, while holding the boundary.
Right.
And what happens then afterwards is after that moment, I say to myself, behavior is communication. Him pouting told me something. His behavior there just said, hey, Mom, those skills about being grateful and understanding privilege and all those things, I don't have those yet. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, my kid's behavior just added something to my list of instead of doing something to my kid, punitive, I'm taking the movie away. What do I need to do for my child to help him have repeated experiences, to build his brain, to have that skill? And so then I think, okay, what kind of repeated experiences? Okay, we can have a gratitude practice that we can start at dinner. We haven't done that for a while. So we're going to do that. And we're going to actually talk about maybe how people in the world live. And I also, though, in that moment taught him, so if discipline is all about teaching, I also taught him he can have more than one emotion at once. He can feel excited about the movies and disappointed about the popcorn. But I think, let's say I had screamed at him, taken away the movies, told him he was a spoiled brat. What I need to do in that moment after that is to start with curiosity with myself, because shame spiral just actually makes me more likely to be reactive again the next time. Shame actually primes our nervous system to be more reactive. So instead I go to curiosity. I really want to be gentle with myself and say, okay, Tina, that was not ideal. What got in the way? This is the question I literally ask myself. What got in the way of you being the parent you would have wanted to be in that moment? And I would say to my kid, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. Can I have a do-over? Right. And then I might say to myself, you know what? I acted that way because I haven't had anything to eat all day. I haven't peed by myself in 3 years and I'm exhausted. Yep. Or I might say, when my kid does that, it reminds me of my dad who really wounded me, I'm pissed at my husband or whatever it is. But it begins to then create a space for me to say, what is it that I need so that I'm ready to
Yes.
stay receptive and get my kid receptive.
Man, I love that so much. Can I give you a quote
Please.
that's
Please.
in the book? So I talk about this and I say, in those moments when we fall short of our best perfect standard for parenting for ourselves, in the same way that punishment is ineffective as a way of teaching our children, punishment is ineffective in the way of teaching ourselves. So in the same way that shame does not teach your children to not do that thing again, shame will not teach you to not do that thing again. Beating yourself up is no better, no more effective than beating up your kid.
And it actually, the research shows it actually makes us more likely to do it again. Yeah.
Of course. And not only that, I would say it's like, it's almost the worst thing you can do, which I know sounds like really, hyperbolic, but like when you beat yourself up, you're more likely to do it again. That's first, because now you have all of those shame associations. And now the next time your kid does it, you're going to be even more reactive because you've those neural pathways from your childhood around shame, around being ungrateful. Now you've just fired those again. So like they got deeper. So that's number one. Number two, you also model to your kid that when you do a thing that you don't like, that this is how you effectively cope, is by, as my therapist says, beating the shit out of yourself. So like, and my dad did that. Like when he was the parent that he didn't want to be, like I watched him just get down on himself about it. And so like, that's what I do. And guess what my 7-year-old does?
Right.
When he doesn't hold up to the perfect
Right.
standard, like so much self-shame. So like, I think that's the second piece. And then the third piece is that shame then leads to the, well, I'm no good and there's no real reason that I should be trying anyway. And I think that that's the thing about saying no drama discipline, saying punishment-free parenting, like however you want to phrase that. I think ultimately at the core, what we have to understand is that we're probably not going to be completely punishment-free for our whole lives. Although by setting that intention and trying hard, we're going to build the neural pathways that we might be able to be. And I think, and I'll say one more thing to kind of wrap us, because I know we're kind of coming to the end here of our time. You said, parenting teenagers isn't any easier. And then you kind of said, well, actually, I think 4 years old was the hardest. I think that's really telling, because I think we say this culturally, like, well, each stage is difficult. But I actually, and this is coming from a person who has only helped people who are parenting teenagers, has not parented teenagers themselves. I actually don't necessarily agree that teenagers aren't easier when we parent effectively when they're young. I actually think parenting without punishment is maybe the harder way to parent a 2-year-old, 4-year-old, 7-year-old. Meaning you don't get the compliance as quickly, as easily, as you have to do much more work, self-work in those early years. It's harder. But when they're 10, 14, 17, especially 24, 34, now I think you've set yourself up. You're playing the long game the whole time, instead of having to like rework and redo and, oh, well, I did this punishment and compliance thing and you never learned how to make decisions. And now I have to deal with a 16-year-old who never learned how to make decisions. I think that's why parents say, oh, each age is like equally hard. Well, yeah, because each age comes with challenges. But if you're training those challenges at 6, they're not going to be the same challenges at 16.
That's exactly right. And I will say, I've loved my boys' teenage years, and, the stakes are higher. The fears are bigger.
Yes.
But I will say my kids, sibling conflict, my kids fought a lot when they were little. When my kids became like 16, 13, and 10, really the last 7 years, there's been almost zero sibling conflict between them. Not that they don't say shitty things to each other, whatever, but we have not dealt with that because we did so much work around that when they were little. And I will say, the teenage years can be really challenging, but I have to come back to control in just a second on this. I have loved the teenage years, and, we're certainly trying to figure out the dance differently. And I will say for me and my family and my kids, the teenage years have been vastly easier than early years.
Yes.
Because I feel like we've been doing we've been building the brain. We've been working on a whole brain, no drama, discipline, yes, brain power, showing up approach to parenting. But here's where I think that, and this is not to say that this is true for everybody, because there are some kids who are neurodiverse, and there are some parents who are neurodiverse, and there are families where trauma has happened, and there are families where there are really significant stressors, and there are health issues, and there are mental health issues and things. So this is not at all to like, you know, families are different. We want to really honor that. But I will say that where I think the things can really go sideways during the adolescent years, more so than the early childhood years, but still in the early childhood years, is around the idea of control. And one of the things I say to parents is, if you are relying on punishment, threat, and control to regulate your child's behavior, you will always lose eventually. Yes. Because when you say to your 15-year-old, and my boys, by the time they were 4, I'm 5'4", and my boys are all 6 feet-ish. By the time they were 14, they were way taller than me. If I said to my 14 or 15-year-old, you're not going out this weekend, if they said, yes, I am, my only options are to try to physically restrain them, which would be ridiculous, or to call law enforcement. So if I'm in a and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Okay.
Right. Not to prove a point. Yeah. Right. Not if you're like personal safety.
Also, that would communicate to my kids, I'm actually not in control. I have to rely on somebody else. Right. You know, I remember one time we were at a restaurant and one of my boys was being a little wild. And I remember at one point I said, oh, here comes the man, here comes the waiter. And my kid immediately like went like this. And I was like, wow, that really worked. But that was one of the worst things I could have said there, because what I just said to my kid is, I'm relying on somebody else to manage you. I can't do that. I'm totally ineffective to do that. And we're going to behave because we're afraid, or we're going to rely on control. So I realized that was a terrible parent thing to do. But what I will say is that, you know, if you're relying on power and control, and that's especially problematic if you have girls, because I also, in my former social work past, was a domestic violence victim advocate. And I will say power and control is actually what leads to all kinds of really dangerous things in relationships down the road. So we don't want to model that anyway. But when we're talking, and for our boys as well, not only girls, but I think when we're relying on power and control and threat-based parenting, we will always lose. And so when you don't do that when they're young, when they get to be teenagers, you're actually not trying to control them. And that's one of the things developmentally that they push most against. So if you're in collaborative conversation and you're saying, this is an issue we need to solve together, you still have firm boundaries and limits. But one of my, and this is like, I know you love to give like really practical hack kinds of things. One of my favorite things to do, starting when they're little, but especially in the teenage years, is to, if something happens, is to say to them, I know you know the lecture I really want to give you right now, so you give it to me. Tell me what I would say right now.
Roll.
And they literally
this is
and I'm like, oh my
role
God,
reversal.
they've been listening to me. Like, I feel so much better. And then they're saying it themselves. They're hearing themselves say it. It's a much better, like they say, if you want to learn something, teach it.
I think it's so I call this role reversal, and it's one of my hacks at the end of the book. And I think you like listed 3 of my hacks actually just now as you went through. But one of them I call it role reversal, and I actually, the way that I frame it is not only like in order to learn something you really have to teach it. How many times, Tina, when you've had them do that, do they say something that you wouldn't have said?
Often.
Right? Like they actually say what they need to hear, not what you necessarily would have said.
And more than that, they actually will be more responsible than what I would have called for, you know, or they might say, so, because usually the follow-up question is, okay, so what do we need to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Or how are we going to handle this the next time? And usually what they come up with is far better than what I would have.
Far more. And often far more restrictive.
Yeah. Oh,
like the funny thing that I do with my 7-year-old, and it's so funny that like, I'll be like, okay, so like we're struggling to hold boundaries around the iPad. Like how can we, and this is the example that I use in the book, it's for collaborative discipline, is like, what do you need from me to get off the iPad when it's time to get off? And he's like, I think I need to take a break from it for a little while. Mm-hmm. And I'm like,
wow, okay. Sure.
Say more. Okay. And he's like, yeah, I think like maybe like 2 months. And I'm like,
wow.
can we start with like a week and then see how you feel? And parent and everyone like, man, it's so funny that like when you do this work and you actually do it this way, it seems unbelievable to the parents that like are not doing it this way, because like every parent just rolled their eyes when I said that, because they're like, oh, my kid would have, they're always trying to get away with something. He would have said like, take it away for an hour. And then like, oh, then no, like when they actually understand that every boundary that you put in place, and in your movie theater example, right? I think there is a moment to hold that boundary. There also is a moment to say like, yeah, you know what? Why don't we get that popcorn? Let's just not have it today. Let's just like put it in a plastic bag. You really like movie theater popcorn. We're not going to go back for a couple weeks. Like that flexibility too is being like, hey, I care about the harm. I don't care about the control.
Totally.
And I think those moments like actually become, and so that flexibility even within the boundaries to say like, yeah, we're still going to hold the boundary, but maybe we can hold it in a different way. Those moments when your kid truly believes that you're on their team, like the discipline gets easy, because like there's never been a time. So my son's sick right now. He's really struggling taking his amoxicillin. He has sensory stuff. It makes his stomach hurt, but he's got to take it. Like, did I have a 45-minute conversation with a 7-year-old about antibiotic resistant bacteria and the threat that it causes to humanity as a whole? And he's like, this kid just like was like, it's so hard. I'll do it for humankind. Like, but like, he's like, I feel better, so I don't want to take it. Right. It makes sense. But like, people are like, that's crazy. Why would you try and explain that to a 7-year-old? It's like, because he asked.
I think, John,
so I think that's so important.
One of the key things that I think is underlying our whole conversation that I haven't yet said is the idea of assuming that we are the leader. Like, so I think a lot of times when we're, like, no, you're not getting the popcorn and you're never having popcorn your entire childhood or whatever it is, that comes from an insecurity about me being fear. In charge. If I assume and feel secure that I am in charge, it actually gives me and my kid a sense that I actually don't have to be rigid. So I talk about how we don't have to change our minds. I mean, we can change our minds even after, I've certainly set boundaries or limits that are ridiculous. Like you can't swim the whole summer, or you can't go to grandma's house now, but I'm like, I have to take you to grandma's house because I have a dentist appointment. So we lay these boundaries down, but if I am secure that I'm in charge and that I'm the leader, then I can easily say, you know what? And I can say, you know what? You made a really good point. I'm going to change my mind. Now, I will say 2 caveats to that. One is there's a huge difference between saying, fine, you can have the popcorn.
Yes,
and saying,
yes.
I'm going to change my mind because I'm still in charge and I'm changing my mind versus I'm giving in to you. And it's a huge difference because it teaches our kids those repeated experiences. If I whine and yell, I'm going to get what I want. We don't want them to do that. But the other piece is that, I think if we are secure in knowing that we're in charge, it does allow us to be less rigid. And that's another one of the 20 discipline mistakes we talked about in the books. You don't have to be rigid. But the other thing I will say is if you have a kid who's a really good negotiator, so if you do that occasionally, they're like, oh, well, there's room to argue. There's room to negotiate. It's actually an incredibly wonderful skill for the prefrontal cortex to try to do that because your kid has to think about your mind and what's going to, what's going to appeal to you. And they're like, but we could have more time together. And they're like, oh, that's going to appeal to mom, One of the things, I had one kid in particular who would just push and push and push until I would then lose it. And then I would just, Sure. So what I learned with that kid is once I said, yes, we can have one more book, or sure, I will change my mind about that. Once I said, but I'm not changing my mind, then I wouldn't change my mind. And so then in the future, the next time I would say, we're not doing that and I'm not changing my mind, then it would stop. Then we wouldn't have the constant pushing and negotiating, which was really important. I've
definitely gotten there. So I definitely have one who's a pusher like that. Unfortunately, he's my 2-year-old. So
it's my youngest too.
I think I definitely have gotten to the point of saying like, I'm sorry, we can't do that. And even reflecting back because he's 2, like, you want mom right now. Mom's not here. Like, at least acknowledging, right? I'm not going to change my mind. Even in saying that, you're saying, I hear you. And that, I think, is another really important aspect that kids have to feel seen, heard, and valued before they care about what your discipline is. Otherwise, you're just the tyrant. And I love that you said that it's an insecurity. I think that that's very, very accurate. And I think that for so many, especially men who I talk to, it's like, man, I feel out of control with these kids. And because of that, I have to like really lock down. And what's so interesting is that like anybody who's studied martial arts, which I haven't, but I've talked to people who have, knows that like trying to be the immovable object is just the way that you are going to get taken down every time by the 5'4" judo expert who's half your weight. Because like, if you try and be rigid, like you are so unbalanced. And I think that that's the truth, is that the moment that I became the parent, more often than not, that's an Elisa Pressman. The moment that I became the parent more often than not that I wanted to be was the moment when I realized that I could be flexible and still be the parent. And I think that that's in the leader, and good leaders do this. I mean, this is not to get into specific politicians, but like, this is one of my measuring sticks for politicians is like, how do you, like, when you're talking about things, how do you respond to somebody making a great point? Like, do you respond with like, no, that's actually a really good point, and I haven't considered that, and I definitely will consider that. Here's my response to that off the cuff. Man, that I'm like, let me follow that woman usually.
Totally. You know,
not usually the men, but
the power of showing up, Dan and I, which is all about secure attachment and how we cultivate it, knowing that it's one of the best predictors for how well kids turn out on everything they're measured on. For me, it talks about the 4 S's, and it's my North Star, which are safe, seen, soothed. So at your worst, that's when you most need connection, and secure, and knowing someone's going to show up for you. So I think even in those discipline moments, like for me, that also is part of the frame of thinking about discipline is, am I responding in a way that helps my kid feel safe and seen and soothed and secure, knowing I'm going to keep showing up no matter what, no matter how they behave, etc. And then really I can then be flexible. I can then, hold my boundary and say what we talk about in several books is the idea that you can say no to a behavior while saying yes to your child and their experience of the behavior. Emotion. We said that, many, many years ago. And Elisa Pressman has a beautiful way of saying it. She says all behaviors are not welcome, but all feelings are welcome. So that's the kind of thing where I can say, I'm not changing my mind about the popcorn, but if you need to be sad about that, it's okay. I'm right here with you while you're feeling sad about the popcorn. Right. Like,
I say to my kids, you can be as mad at me as you want to be.
I can handle your big feelings, and I trust that you can handle your big feelings of disappointment or sadness or unfairness that your brother gets to stay up later than you. I trust that you can handle those big feelings. I'm not going to overprotect you from those feelings and experiences, knowing that the way we become resilient is by practicing dealing with difficult experiences and feelings and those kinds of things. I kind of have this
frustration.
I kind of have this formula I made up that's oversimplified, but the idea is, adversity minus connection or support is what leads to fragility, and adversity plus support and connection leads to resilience. But not too much support and not too much, not bubble wrapping, right? That's a different whole thing.
Yeah, that's similar to the Harvard school, the different types of, it's not ruler, it's the different types of traumas, right? The ruler is the toxic, Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, right?
Positive, tolerable, and toxic.
Right, and it's the adversity is like, those are the positive stressors. Adversity plus connection is the tolerable, or is the positive. The too much adversity but still connection is the tolerable, and then the any adversity with no connection is the toxic. And I think so I think that that's a perfect way of kind of, that's a perfect way of ending. I mean, we could go back and forth. I have so much more to ask you all. We'll have to have you back on soon. But this has been such a helpful conversation. Thank you, Tina. Where can we find you? What's the work that you're working on right now? What can we be excited for?
I'm excited about The Way of Play, co-authored with Georgie, who is a play therapist, and it's called The Way of Play, out in January 25. And it's about how to play with our children. Lots of parents know, we think of play as a way to pass time or just something our kids want to do, and it's really boring and most parents don't like it. So this is like 7 strategies for how to play with your kids in ways that build relationship, build skills, and make it more fun for you. And it's a way of being. That's why it's called the way of play. And you can find me on social media at Tina Payne Bryson, and my website's tinabryson.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
I'm so excited about the work that you're doing in your book. So thank you so much for having me.
We'll have to have like an exchange of Instagram story or something in January 25 when we're both putting out the books.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Guys, I hope that you enjoyed that episode, listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. I don't think that's possible, but if you did, that's fantastic. And if you did, there is absolutely no reason why you shouldn't jump on right now to whatever podcasting platform you're listening to and write a review if that's available, and definitely rate this podcast 5 stars, because I'm telling you, this was an epic episode for me. I feel like we talked about so many of the different pieces, so many of the misconceptions that people come away with, so many of the basics of healthy parenting, and we even push back, on some of the things that maybe aren't as healthy parenting that come off as healthy parenting on social media. So if you are interested in listening to more episodes, obviously subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're listening to, but you can also go to the link in the description in the show notes, and you can click on that first link and join the email list. Every single Thursday, I send out an email. Sometimes it's supplemental to the podcast, things related to what we talked about that week on the podcast, and other times it's just good parenting tips. A couple weeks ago, I sent out 3 tips for parents with picky eaters. I've talked about how to help kids process with trauma. I've talked about so many different things on that email list. And so all you got to do, just enter your information there, your first name and your email, and you'll join the email list, and you'll be up to date on not only the amazing stuff that we have going on at Whole Parent, but just regular good content for you. That's all I have for you today. That was the episode. I feel like I just got to stop talking because this has already been so long. But guys, thank you so much for letting me do this, for being the people who listen to this on a regular basis so that I get to have these conversations. I cannot tell you how grateful I am that I am able to even do this. And it's because of you. It's because of the people who rate and review. It's because of the people who join the email list. It's because of you. And so thank you so much. And I'll see you next time on the Whole Parent Podcast.